Do we know that human beings are unique? I'll tell you how. Because God became one. Because God became one. Have we got that? It's staggering. It makes Harari's hopes look piffling by comparison. They're stretching towards making a God and creating a human life in a laboratory. How far they'll get, we don't know. But what has already happened in world history is that God has become human. And therefore, this gives us extraordinary hope. United in your resurrection, sang Kristen, you lift us to infinite life. But now comes the big question, ladies and gentlemen. Do we really believe it? What I mean by that is this. Do we believe it enough to share it? Do we believe it enough to step into the public space and talk to people that are hoping for the abolition of physical death, are hoping to upgrade their brains, are hoping to secure some kind of immortality by uploading the contents of their mind onto silicon? Have we got the courage to step into the public space in our businesses, with our colleagues, in our universities, in our workplaces, and say we believe this stuff? Or have we caved into the pressure of a society that rejects this as vigorously as it possibly can? That's the question. It's all very well, and it's faith offers not only extraordinary hope, but a unique hope based on the conquest of death, the enemy that is feared by all. And it's based not on the future conquest of death, but on the past conquest of death. Our conference theme is declaring extraordinary hope. And one of our wonderful, uniquely human capacities is the ability to think about the future. And the word hope simply means expectation for the future. Physicist John Polkinghorne, who taught me years ago in Cambridge, says, if we are to understand the nature of reality, we have only two possible starting points: either the brute fact of the physical world or the brute fact of a divine will and purpose behind that physical world. The first starting point is materialism or naturalism. And it believes that this material universe is all that exists. And everything in it, including you and me, our minds, our abilities, has come to exist through mindless, unguided forces. In a current bestseller, another physicist, Sean Carroll, writes, we humans are blobs of organized mud, which through the impersonal workings of nature's patterns have developed the capacity to contemplate and cherish and engage with the intimidating complexity of the world around us. The meaning we find in life is not transcendent. The only meaning is the meaning we can generate. There is no ultimate hope beyond the horizon of physical death. This is atheism. And therefore we have to be content with lesser hopes that we create for ourselves and that keep us going at least until we die. And the ancient Greeks were very aware of this. They could see that people have all kinds of hopes, one after the other. I hope to get an apprenticeship, or I hope to go to university. Why? To get a good job. Why? Well, I'd like to get married. Why? Well, I'd love to have children. Why? Well, I'd like to succeed in business and give them a good education. Why? So that they could get a good job. Well, why would they want to do that? So that they could get married and have children. And the Greeks saw that life for many people is circular, and that our hopes focus on the next horizon, and then we have a new hope, and that focuses on the next horizon. But the thing we never ask is, where is the whole thing actually going? Is there anything that gets us out of the circle? Is there anything that gives us a meaning and a hope that transcends this? The ancient biblical story, it relates.
In the dialogue above, the speaker argues that if reality is understood purely from a materialist starting point, human hope is inevitably confined to a finite biological circle with no meaning beyond death. And I believe this argument is correct, because a worldview that cannot transcend death cannot ultimately ground meaning. This opening section establishes the intellectual fault line on which the entire talk rests. Lennox does not begin by attacking atheism emotionally or morally. He begins by exposing its structural limitation. By defining hope as expectation for the future, he makes the question unavoidable. What kind of future does a materialist worldview actually allow? The description of human beings as organized mud is not mocked here. It is taken seriously. Lennox allows materialism to speak in its own voice and then follows its implications to their logical conclusion. If mind is the accidental product of mindless forces, then meaning cannot be discovered, only invented. And what is invented has no authority beyond the individual or the moment. The Greek illustration of circular hopes is philosophically precise. Education leads to work, work to family, family to success, success back to the same cycle. None of these hopes are wrong, but none of them answer the deeper question: where is the whole story going? Materialism offers motion without destination. It keeps people busy, but it never tells them why they exist. Lennox's key insight here is that atheism does not eliminate hope, it redefines it downward. Hope becomes psychological endurance rather than rational expectation. It helps you cope until death, but it offers no answer to death itself. That is not a personal insult, it is a logical observation. What makes this argument sharp is its restraint. Lennox does not yet claim Christianity is true. He simply shows that materialism, by its own assumptions, cannot deliver transcendent meaning. Before asking whether the Christian story is believable, he asks whether the alternative is livable. This sets the stage for everything that follows. Once hope is exposed as the central issue, the resurrection is no longer a peripheral doctrine. It becomes the decisive question: has death actually been conquered, or are we only telling ourselves comforting stories? Let us now continue with the debate or discussion.
That's how the serpent enemy misrepresented God, suggesting that God wished to limit human freedom by not letting the humans become as God. And the deception worked. The fall is what happened when man began to think of himself as more than an image of God and desired to be a God. And when humans fell, the sin that infected the entire human race from the start was a prideful revolt of the human spirit against the God who created it. God said, "In the day you eat of it, you shall surely die." And the whole infection that has flawed human beings in an ever-increasing stream since the beginning came at a sharp point in ancient history when God spoke and humans disobeyed God. As Christians, ladies and gentlemen, the greatest pressure that you and I will experience is the pressure to compromise and in the end downright disobey what God has said. The book of Genesis tells us about the universe, the heavens that declare the glory of God, and humans who were made in the image of God. How did they come to be? They came to be because God spoke, and God said, "Let there be light," and God said. And the climax of that story is the remarkable statement, "And God said to them." And you and I are unique. We're made in the image of God. And one thing that means above all is that we can hear God's voice, not only in the wind, but in his word. And God said. But do we believe what God has said? When he speaks of life and death, and man and woman, and truth and falsehood, because the pressure in our society is as never before.
In the dialogue above, the speaker argues that the root of the human crisis is not ignorance, but moral and spiritual pride. Humanity no longer wishes to be the image of God, but to take the place of God, and I believe this argument is correct, because the history of ideas shows that increased knowledge does not necessarily produce moral humility or obedience. This section shifts the discussion from philosophy to anthropology. Lennox reframes the biblical account of the fall not as a myth about curiosity, but as a diagnosis of moral rebellion. The problem is not that humans wanted to know more. It is that they wanted to be more than creatures, more than images, more than receivers of truth. The serpent's deception is subtle and psychologically accurate. God is portrayed not as a giver of life, but as a limiter of freedom. Once that narrative is accepted, obedience begins to look like oppression, and humility begins to look like weakness. Lennox is not merely retelling a theological story, he is describing a pattern that repeats itself in every age, especially in intellectual cultures that prize autonomy above all else. The pressure he names is crucial, the pressure to compromise what God has said. This is not primarily external persecution, it is internal rationalization. Modern societies rarely demand outright rejection of belief. Instead, they reward selective obedience, believing just enough to remain respectable but not enough to be costly. What makes this argument sharp is that it refuses the comforting illusion that disobedience is always caused by lack of evidence. Often, the issue is not that God has not spoken clearly, but that what has been spoken conflicts with human desires. Lennox implies that the greatest intellectual battles are not fought in laboratories or lecture halls, but in the will. There is also an implicit warning here for believers. If the original fall was driven by pride, then intellectual pride remains one of the most dangerous temptations for religious people as well. One can defend God publicly while quietly refusing to obey him privately. Lennox's logic cuts both ways. By grounding the crisis of modern humanity in rebellion rather than ignorance, this section prepares the listener for a radical conclusion. No amount of technological or cognitive advancement can heal a moral rupture. If the problem is relational, alienation from God, then the solution must also be relational, not mechanical. This is why the talk cannot remain at the level of ideas. It must move toward incarnation, obedience, and ultimately redemption. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion.
And when the first humans took the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, Please notice, ladies and gentlemen, there is a lie believed by many intellectuals in the world today that it was the tree of knowledge and that God was against knowledge. It wasn't the tree of knowledge at all. There was knowledge aplenty in the ancient garden. They could explore it. They could follow the rivers. They could develop the minerals. They could enjoy their aesthetic sense. They could work. They could relate to God. Vast fields of knowledge were open to them. It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that's knowledge you don't really want to have.
In the dialogue above, the speaker argues that the common belief that God is opposed to knowledge is a serious distortion. The problem is not knowledge itself, but humanity's desire to define good and evil independently of God. And I believe this argument is correct because Scripture presents knowledge as a gift that requires moral orientation rather than suppression. This section directly confronts one of the most persistent caricatures of the Christian worldview, that faith and knowledge are enemies. Lennox dismantles this claim by paying close attention to the text itself. The forbidden tree was not the tree of knowledge in general, but the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That distinction is not semantic, it is foundational. By emphasizing the abundance of knowledge available in the garden, exploration, creativity, work, aesthetics, Lennox reframes the biblical narrative as radically pro-intellectual. Human beings were invited to investigate creation, not shielded from it. The restriction was moral, not cognitive. It concerned authority, not curiosity. The desire to determine good and evil autonomously is presented as the true rupture. This is not a rejection of learning. It is a rejection of accountability. When humans claim the right to define morality apart from any transcendent reference, knowledge becomes detached from wisdom. Information increases, but moral clarity decreases. Lennox subtly connects this ancient pattern to contemporary culture. Modern societies often celebrate choice as the highest good, yet increasingly delegate those choices to systems and technologies shaped by hidden values and biases. The irony is striking. In rejecting divine authority, humans do not become free agents. They become subject to opaque human or machine authorities. This argument avoids nostalgia. Lennox does not suggest a return to ignorance or anti-scientific retreat. Instead, he insists that knowledge without moral grounding is dangerous precisely because it is powerful. The issue is not whether we can know more, but whether we know what we ought to do with what we know. By exposing the false dichotomy between faith and knowledge, this section clears the ground for a deeper critique of technological optimism. If the core problem is moral autonomy, then no increase in data, processing power, or artificial intelligence can resolve it. The question of good and evil cannot be outsourced. This prepares the listener for the next step in the argument. When knowledge is severed from moral truth, technological progress does not liberate humanity. It redefines it in increasingly reductive ways. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion.
But the lie keeps going, that God's going to suppress knowledge. We now need to realize that we humans want as much choice as possible, and yet we are increasingly rapidly delegating our choice to a machine that's usually programmed by others, and therefore embodies their decisions and not ours. We increasingly push our decisions into machines, and they are deciding about us, our credit rating. For instance, machines are programmed by humans, and humans have a track record of bias and even malevolence. The machine that decides on the medicines could be using biased data. And Leon Kass, a brilliant professor of social thought at the University of Chicago, has given a sober warning. We have paid, he says, some high prices for the technological conquest of nature, but none so high as the intellectual and spiritual costs of seeing nature as mere material for our manipulation, exploitation, and transformation. With the powers of biological engineering gathering, there will be splendid new opportunities for similar degradation of our view of man. If we come to see ourselves as meat, then meat we shall become. Is that where we, and even more so our children and our grandchildren, are going to find hope? These developments in our society mean we need to get back to Scripture and to see what it has to offer in the way of hope to flawed and even broken humanity. God
In the dialogue above, the speaker argues that while humans desire ever greater freedom and choice, modern society paradoxically hands decision-making power over to machines programmed by humans, carrying human biases and moral limitations. And I believe this argument is correct, because transferring moral judgment to technology does not eliminate bias. It merely conceals it behind technical systems. This section marks a decisive transition from ancient moral rebellion to modern technological substitution. Lennox identifies a profound irony at the heart of contemporary culture. The same societies that reject divine authority in the name of autonomy increasingly surrender human agency to automated systems. The examples are deliberately practical rather than abstract. Credit ratings, medical decisions, and social classifications are increasingly shaped by algorithms. These systems are often described as neutral or objective, yet Lennox reminds us of an inconvenient truth. Machines do not transcend human morality, they inherit it. Every dataset reflects past human choices, and every model encodes human priorities. By citing Leon Kass, Lennox deepens the critique. The danger is not merely technical error, but a spiritual and intellectual cost. When nature is reduced to raw material for manipulation, humanity itself is reclassified as something to be optimized, redesigned, or discarded. The language of improvement quietly replaces the language of dignity. The phrase, "if we see ourselves as meat, then meat we shall become," is intentionally unsettling. It exposes the ethical trajectory of a worldview that denies intrinsic human worth. Once humans are defined purely in functional terms, moral limits appear arbitrary. Exploitation becomes efficiency. Control becomes care. What makes this argument sharp is its refusal to demonize technology. Lennox does not claim machines are evil. He claims they are insufficient. Technology can extend power, but it cannot generate moral authority. When moral vision is absent, increased power magnifies harm rather than preventing it. This section also anticipates the coming discussion of transhumanism. If humans are merely biological systems, then upgrading them seems logical. But if humans possess inherent dignity grounded beyond material processes, then upgrading risks becoming a category mistake, treating persons as projects. The deeper warning here is not about the future, it is about the present. A society that replaces moral reasoning with technical efficiency does not become wiser. It becomes faster at making mistakes. Lennox's concern is not that machines will think like humans, but that humans will begin to think like machines. Let us now continue with the debate or discussion.